"You're not welcome here," my son's wife hissed through clenched teeth as I stood frozen at their doorstep, gift bag in hand, the rain soaking through my cardigan. Behind her, my 9-month-old grandson reached his tiny arms toward me and called out, "Nana," for the very first time. The sound of his voice made my heart swell and break simultaneously. She stepped forward, blocking my view of him, her eyes cold as Vermont winter. I said, "You need to leave. Now." The door slammed in my face with such force that the porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the welcome mat I'd gifted them when they bought the house. The one with "Family makes this house a home" stitched into it. I stood there, paralyzed, as the rain mixed with my tears, the baby's toys visible through the bay window, his cries now audible even through the heavy oak door. I'd driven 3 hours from my small apartment in Albany to Springfield, Massachusetts for this moment, to see my only grandchild on his birthday. 3 hours of practicing what I'd say, how I wouldn't overstep, how I'd respect their boundaries. 3 hours of hopeful anticipation that perhaps this time would be different. I'd baked his favorite banana muffins, the recipe my own mother had passed down to me. I'd wrapped the hand-knitted sweater I'd spent months making, checking and rechecking his size from the few photos Michael still shared with me. I'd even bought something small for Jessica, a peace offering, a delicate silver bracelet I could barely afford on my teacher's pension. The neighbor across the street was watching now, pretending to collect her mail as she stared at the spectacle of a 63-year-old woman being turned away from her own son's home. The shame burned hotter than the tears streaming down my face. I clutched the gift bag tighter, the paper now soggy and tearing at the handles. Inside was a card I'd spent hours writing and rewriting, trying to find words that wouldn't offend Jessica, but would still remind Michael of who we once were to each other, of the unbreakable bond I thought we had. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the garden I'd helped them plant last spring, before everything fell apart. Before the whispered accusations, the gradual distancing, the canceled dinners, and finally, the ultimatum Michael had delivered in a voice I barely recognized. "Mom, Jessica thinks it's best if we take some space from you for a while." That while had stretched into 6 months of agony, of calls that went to voicemail, of text messages read but never answered, of social media photos I was allowed to see but never be part of. I turned slowly, my arthritis flaring in the damp cold, and made my way back to my 10-year-old Honda, the car that had driven Michael to soccer practice, to his first date, to college, the car that now felt like a time capsule of a life I no longer had access to. As I reached for the door handle, I heard the front door of their house open again. My heart leapt. Perhaps Michael had seen me, had overruled his wife, was coming to invite me in from the storm. Instead, Jessica stepped onto the porch, her face a mask of controlled anger. "And don't try calling him again. He's done explaining himself to you. We're done with your manipulation." She held up her phone, screen facing me, though I couldn't see what was displayed from this distance. "We know what you've been saying about me to the family, to his friends. It stops now, or the next conversation will be through our lawyer." The phone in my purse vibrated. Probably Linda, my sister, checking if I'd made it safely, wondering how the reunion was going. How could I tell her that there was no reunion? That the grandson who had just called me Nana was being pulled away from me by invisible strings I couldn't fight? That my son, my sweet boy, who once couldn't fall asleep without my hand on his back, now allowed me to be treated like a trespasser? I started the engine with trembling hands. The gift bag crumpled on the passenger seat beside me. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught a final glimpse of my grandson's face pressed against the window, his small palm flat against the glass, his mouth forming that precious word again. Nana, a name I'd waited a lifetime to be called, now turned into the cruelest of goodbyes. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, though most people in Millfield, the small town where I taught English for 30 years, still call me Mrs. Mitchell. Even now, 3 years into retirement, former students wave at me in the grocery store aisles of Price Chopper, or stop me at the Millfield Diner to tell me how my Shakespeare unit changed their lives. It's a comfort, these small recognitions, these reminders that I once had purpose beyond the hollow shell my life has become. The apartment I moved to after selling the family home feels temporary, even after 2 years. Beige walls I'm not allowed to paint, beige carpets I'm afraid to stain. A stark contrast to the vibrant blue Victorian where I raised Michael, where my late husband Thomas and I had built a life filled with books and music and Sunday pancake breakfasts. I didn't want to sell it, but the property taxes kept climbing. And after Thomas died from the heart attack 5 years ago, the maintenance became too much. "It's too big for just you anyway, Mom," Michael had reasoned, helping me pack 30 years of memories into labeled boxes. "You'll feel liberated with less space to worry about." Liberated wasn't the word I would choose. Displaced, perhaps. Diminished. Every morning I wake at 6:15, a habit from decades of teaching that my body refuses to abandon. I make a single cup of coffee in the small kitchen with its laminate countertops, so unlike the butcher block Thomas had installed as an anniversary gift. I water the few plants that survived the move, speak to them in the gentle voice I once used with my classroom's struggling readers. "You're doing great," I tell the spider plant, though its edges are browning. "Just a little more sunlight and you'll thrive." 3 days a week I volunteer at the Millfield Public Library, shelving books and running the children's story hour. The kids remind me of Michael at that age, eager and open-hearted, their questions endless and sincere. Sometimes I bring homemade cookies, breaking the library's food policy in a small act of rebellion the director pretends not to notice. It's the closest I get to grandmother duties, these Tuesday and Thursday mornings surrounded by other people's children. The other days stretch before me like an empty road. I've joined a book club at the community center, though the selections rarely challenge me and the discussions lack the depth I crave. I take water aerobics at the YMCA with women my age, whose conversations revolve around grandchildren and cruises, topics that only highlight what's missing from my life. I write letters to old friends who rarely respond, their lives too full, or their fingers too arthritic for the dying art of correspondence. And I wait. I wait for Michael to remember who we were to each other, before Jessica came into his life 4 years ago. Before the subtle shifts in his behavior, the defensive tone when I asked innocent questions, the gradual reshaping of his memories of his childhood. "You were always so critical, Mom," he told me during our last real conversation, his voice flat and unfamiliar. "You never gave me space to be myself." Words that felt scripted, foreign in his mouth, contradicting the hundreds of drawings he'd made me over the years with "World's Best Mom" scrawled in crayon. Jessica was beautiful and ambitious, with a law degree from Boston University and a family with connections in Connecticut politics. Next to her, my life as a public school teacher in upstate New York seemed small and provincial. From the beginning, she measured me with cool eyes, corrected my grammar at family dinners, questioned my outdated opinions on child rearing when I offered unsolicited advice during her pregnancy. "You need to set boundaries with your mother," I overheard her tell Michael at Thanksgiving last year, not realizing I was returning from the bathroom. "She doesn't respect our parenting choices." This after I'd suggested that perhaps 9 hours was too long for their colicky 6-month-old to go without feeding overnight, an observation that came from raising a colicky baby of my own, not from judgment. When baby James was born, I expected everything to change. I drove to the hospital with a heart so full it threatened to burst from my chest, carrying the quilt I'd spent the entire pregnancy sewing. In the maternity ward, Jessica's parents were already there, her mother holding the newborn, her father slapping Michael on the back with proprietary pride. "The Davis knows," her mother cooed, tracing James's tiny profile. "He's got your father's chin, Jess." When I was finally allowed to hold him, Jessica watched me like a hawk, adjusting my arm position though I'd held dozens of infants as a volunteer at the hospital over the years. Now, as I pull into the parking lot of my apartment complex after the disastrous birthday visit attempt, I realize I've been driving on autopilot, the 3-hour journey passing in a blur of tears and unanswerable questions. The rain has followed me home, turning the potholed lot into a maze of puddles. I sit with the engine off, watching the raindrops race down the windshield, blurring the security light into a halo of uncertainty. My phone shows 3 missed calls from Linda. I should call her back, tell her what happened, listen to her outrage on my behalf. But I'm exhausted by the story, by the telling and retelling of my gradual excommunication from my son's life. Instead, I gather the damp gift bag and my purse, and make my way up the external stairs to my second-floor unit, each step sending pain through my arthritic knee. Inside, the silence greets me like an old friend, familiar, expected, but never welcome. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet from the Grand Canyon, our last family vacation before Thomas died, is the only photo I have of James. 3 months old, nestled in blue blankets, his eyes, Michael's eyes, staring directly into the camera. It was sent as a birth announcement to the extended family, not specifically to me. Now, at 9 months, he looks different in the Instagram photos Michael occasionally posts. Bigger, more alert, saying Nana for the first time to a grandmother he's being taught to forget. I place the gift bag on the counter and finally allow myself to collapse, sliding down against the refrigerator until I'm sitting on the linoleum floor, my wet clothes leaving puddles beneath me. "Nana," I whisper to the empty kitchen, testing the sound of it, holding it like a precious stone in my mouth. Then I begin to sob, deep, guttural cries that seem to come from someone else, someone I don't recognize, someone who has lost everything that ever mattered. The first real betrayal came 3 months after James was born, though the foundation had been laid long before. It was at James's christening, a ceremony I nearly missed entirely. The invitation arrived just 2 days before the event, a formal card with gold embossing that looked suspiciously like an afterthought, wedged between bills in my mailbox. St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Springfield was Jessica's family church, though Michael had been raised Presbyterian. I arrived early, dressed in the new blue dress I'd splurged on, carrying a small silver cross necklace that had been in the Mitchell family for generations. Thomas's mother had given it to Michael at his own christening, with the understanding that it would be passed down. I'd mentioned it to Michael weeks earlier, when I first asked about christening plans, but he'd been vague, saying they were still figuring things out. The church parking lot was already full when I arrived, filled with luxury SUVs and late-model European sedans that made my Honda seem even more faded. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with conversation, but as I walked down the aisle, looking for a familiar face or an empty seat, I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. The first 5 rows on both sides were filled with people I didn't recognize, women in Chanel suits, and men in tailored blazers, who turned to regard me with curious, assessing eyes, before returning to their conversations. In the 6th row, I finally spotted Linda and her husband, along with Thomas's brother Robert and his wife. The Mitchell family, relegated to the back, like distant acquaintances, rather than blood relatives. "Eleanor," Linda whispered, as I slid in beside her, her eyes wide with warning. "Did you know about all this?" Before I could answer, the organ began to play, and we all stood. The ceremony proceeded with a formality that felt foreign to me. Jessica's father walked her down the aisle as if it were a second wedding. James in her arms wearing a christening gown I'd never seen before, not the one Thomas had worn, the one I'd carefully preserved in tissue paper in the attic of the house I no longer owned. Michael followed several steps behind them, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed newly purchased, his hair styled differently than I'd ever seen it. He didn't look at me as he passed our row, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face a mask of concentration as if he were trying to remember lines in a play. The godparents were called forward, Jessica's sister Amber, her college roommate Stephanie, and 2 men I'd never met, but who were apparently partners at Jessica's law firm. No mention of family from Michael's side. No acknowledgement of the tradition that would have made Linda's son, Michael's cousin and closest childhood friend, a godfather. Michael and Jessica have prepared personal vows for this sacred occasion, the minister announced, and my confusion deepened. Personal vows? At a christening? This wasn't how our family had done things. This wasn't what we had discussed when Michael was growing up, and we talked about his future children. Jessica spoke first, her voice clear and practiced. She promised to raise James with proper values and advantages, to ensure he had every opportunity to develop his full potential, and to guide him toward the kind of success and social standing that befits his heritage. She spoke about her family's legacy, their prominence in Massachusetts society, their expectations for the next generation. Not once did she mention love, or joy, or the simple happiness of watching a child discover the world. When it was Michael's turn, I leaned forward, hoping to hear something of the boy I'd raised, the man who once told me he wanted to be the kind of father who built blanket forts and coached Little League. Instead, what came out of his mouth felt like it had been written by someone else. "I promise to break cycles of limitation," he said, his voice slightly trembling. "To give James opportunities I wasn't given, to raise him with a broader worldview, free from the constraints of small-town thinking." His eyes flickered briefly toward our row, then away. I promised to protect him from influences that would hold him back, to surround him only with people who will elevate his life, not complicate it. Linda's hand found mine, squeezing hard. Robert shifted uncomfortably beside us. We all heard what wasn't being said, felt the blade slide between our ribs with surgical precision. After the ceremony, there was a reception at Jessica's parents' country club. I approached the receiving line with my gift, heart pounding, determined to maintain dignity, despite the growing knot of dread in my stomach. Eleanor, Jessica's mother, Vivian, acknowledged me with a nod that somehow managed to look down at me despite our similar height. How nice you could make it on such short notice. There was some confusion with the invitations, I understand. I'm just glad I could be here, I replied, forcing a smile. Michael, the ceremony was lovely. I reached for my son, wanting to hug him, to ground myself in the familiar smell of him, the solid reality of the boy I'd raised. He gave me a quick, stiff embrace, his body unyielding against mine. Thanks for coming, Mom. Then, lower, almost a whisper. Try not to bring up the family christening gown, okay? Jessica's mom had this one specially made. Before I could respond, I was being moved along the line by the press of guests behind me. I handed the small, carefully wrapped package containing the silver cross to Jessica, who took it with a distracted, "Thank you," before passing it to a woman who appeared to be collecting gifts at a designated table. At the reception, I found myself seated at a table far from the main party, with distant cousins of Jessica's and a few elderly relatives who seemed confused about whose event they were attending. The Mitchell table, as Linda sardonically called it, was positioned behind a large floral arrangement that partially obscured our view of the head table, where Michael sat between Jessica and her father, nodding at whatever was being said to him. I barely touched the expertly prepared meal, my appetite gone. When the toast began, Jessica's father spoke at length about legacy and the joining of two fine families, though he mentioned the Mitchells only in passing, describing Thomas, who had been a respected pediatrician in our community, merely as Michael's late father. Jessica's mother spoke next, talking about how she'd guide her daughter through the challenges of motherhood, offering her wisdom and support, as if I weren't sitting 20 feet away, as if I hadn't raised a child of my own. When I approached the head table later, hoping for a moment with the baby, Jessica intercepted me with practiced smoothness. "James is overwhelmed with all the excitement," she explained, though I could see him contentedly being bounced on her sister's knee nearby. "The pediatrician says we need to be careful about overstimulation. You understand." "Of course," I said, swallowing my disappointment. "Maybe I could come visit next weekend. I could bring those children's books we talked about, the ones Michael loved." Jessica's smile remained fixed, her eyes cooling. "We're actually starting a very specific early literacy program with him. It's based on the latest research from Harvard. The books need to follow a particular developmental sequence." She touched my arm, a gesture that felt more dismissive than comforting. "But we'll definitely set something up soon, once we get settled into a routine." As I drove home alone that evening, the implications of the day settled over me like a heavy fog. The careful positioning of the Mitchell family in the church, the personal vows with their thinly veiled rejections of Michael's upbringing, the seating arrangement that kept me far from my only grandchild, the casual dismissal of family traditions that had meant so much to Thomas and me. But it was when I arrived home and unpacked the small overnight bag I'd brought, just in case I was invited to stay longer, that the final piece fell into place. A notification popped up on my phone. Michael had tagged me in a social media post. Heart-lifting, I opened it, hoping for a photo of James and me, some acknowledgement of my presence at this important day. Instead, it was a group photo of the event, dozens of people arranged on the country club's manicured lawn. I was visible at the very edge of the frame, partially cut off, while Jessica's extended family dominated the center. The caption read, "Celebrating James Thomas Davis's christening with, almost, all our loved ones." Almost. That single word, so casually cruel in its offhandedness, confirmed what I'd felt throughout the day. I wasn't missing from the center of the photo by accident. I was being deliberately pushed to the margins of my son's new life, my grandson's future. And Michael, my sweet boy who once brought me wildflowers just because it was Tuesday, was not only allowing it, he was participating in it. I placed my phone face down on the nightstand and sat on the edge of my bed, the silence of my apartment pressing in around me. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt truly alone. Not just physically isolated, but erased. The kind of aloneness that comes from realizing that the story you thought you were in, the one where you're a beloved mother, a welcomed grandmother, a valued matriarch, was actually a different story entirely. One where you were never meant to have a leading role. The day Michael was born, a spring thunderstorm knocked out power to half of Millfield. Thomas and I had joked throughout my pregnancy that our baby would make a dramatic entrance. He'd kicked and somersaulted so vigorously during those 9 months that Thomas nicknamed him the Acrobat before we'd even settled on Michael. The delivery room was lit by emergency generators and battery-powered lamps, giving everything a surreal amber glow. 17 hours of labor, and then suddenly there he was. 7 pounds, 4 ounces of perfection, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in the entire world at once. Thomas cried, pressing his forehead against mine as he held our son between us. A triangle of love completed. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Ellie," he whispered, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Look what we made. Look what you did." We brought Michael home to the blue Victorian that Thomas had inherited from his grandparents, the house we'd spent 2 years renovating ourselves on weekends and summer breaks. The nursery was pale yellow with hand-painted clouds drifting across the ceiling, my contribution during the 7th month of pregnancy, when I could no longer climb ladders or help with the more strenuous renovations. Those early days were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Michael had colic for the first 3 months, crying inconsolably between midnight and 4 a.m. I walked miles around that nursery, singing every song I knew, reciting Shakespeare sonnets, telling stories from my childhood. Thomas would take over at 4 a.m. so I could sleep for 2 hours before he left for his rounds at the hospital. We were tired, yes, but never resentful. Every cry meant Michael was breathing, living, needing us. Every difficult night was a gift we'd been given. When he was 8 months old, just younger than James is now, Michael contracted pneumonia. 3 nights in the pediatric ward, Thomas pulling every string he could at the hospital to ensure the best care, me refusing to leave Michael's side even to shower or change clothes. I slept in a chair beside his crib, one hand through the bars to rest on his small chest, needing to feel it rise and fall. When his fever broke on the 3rd night, I wept with relief, my tears falling onto the hospital linoleum as Thomas held me, both of us trembling with gratitude. I took a year's unpaid leave from teaching when Michael was born, stretching our budget to breaking point. We cut back on everything. No new clothes, no dinners out, no vacations. Thomas picked up extra shifts at the hospital to compensate for my lost income. When I did return to work, we couldn't afford full-time daycare, so we cobbled together a schedule. Thomas's mother watched Michael 2 days a week. I taught my English classes on a compressed schedule 3 days a week, and Thomas adjusted his hospital rounds to cover the gaps. Every penny we saved went toward Michael's future. The college fund we started when he was still in diapers, the swimming lessons he loved, the children's museum memberships, the shelves of books that lined his room. We didn't have the advantages Jessica's family could provide, the country club memberships, the European vacations, the private schools, but we gave him a home overflowing with love, curiosity, and laughter. When Michael was 7, Thomas's mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Without hesitation, we converted our home office into a bedroom for her, rearranging our lives once more to accommodate someone we loved. For 3 years, she lived with us as her mind gradually slipped away. Michael helped me care for her, bringing her tea, reading to her from the same books she had once read to him, holding her hand when she became confused and frightened. "You don't have to do this, buddy," I told him one evening, finding him sitting beside his grandmother as she dozed, a book open on his lap. "You can go play with your friends." He looked up at me with Thomas's earnest eyes. "But she's family, Mom. We take care of family." Those words, from a 10-year-old boy who understood instinctively what it meant to be connected by blood and love and shared history. The same boy who, 22 years later, would stand in a church and implicitly reject those connections, who would allow his wife to cut me out of their lives as if I were a stranger, or worse, a threat. When Michael was 11, Thomas was offered a prestigious position at a children's hospital in Chicago. More money, more prestige, a significant step up in his career. We discussed it over several weeks, weighing the professional opportunity against the life we'd built in Millfield. "I don't want to uproot Michael," Thomas said one night after we'd put our son to bed. "He's thriving here. His friends, his school, your mother nearby, and you love your job. But this is your dream," I argued, knowing how hard he'd worked, how much the recognition meant to him. "We could make it work in Chicago." In the end, Thomas declined the offer. "Some dreams change," he told me, squeezing my hand across our kitchen table. 20 years ago, my dream was to be the youngest chief of pediatrics in the country. Now my dream is Sunday morning pancakes with you and Michael, little league games, and growing old in this ridiculous blue house. That sacrifice, one of many we both made, never felt like a burden. It was a choice made with love, with the understanding that family came first. Always. When Michael was 14, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. Terminal, the doctor said. 6 months, maybe less. I took another unpaid leave from teaching to care for her in her final months. Thomas covered the financial shortfall by taking weekend shifts. Michael stepped up at home, learning to do laundry and cook basic meals, never complaining about the time I spent at my mother's bedside instead of at his soccer games or school events. The night before she died, my mother held Michael's hand and told him, "Take care of your mama for me. She thinks she's so strong, but she'll need you." He promised solemnly, tears in his eyes, though he barely understood the weight of what was being asked of him. And he did take care of me in his teenage way. The morning after the funeral, I found a cup of coffee on my bedside table, made the way I liked it, strong, with just a splash of milk. Beside it was a note in his messy 14-year-old handwriting. "I love you, Mom. We're going to be okay." When it came time for college, Michael received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities, including 2 Ivy League schools. The scholarships weren't enough to cover the full cost, and despite our careful saving, we were facing significant loans to make up the difference. "I can go to state," Michael told us, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by financial aid forms. "It's a good school, and with my grades, I'd get a full ride." Thomas and I exchanged a look across the table, an entire conversation passing between us without words. Then Thomas said, "We'll figure it out, son. If Dartmouth is where you want to go, that's where you'll go." We took out a second mortgage on the house. Thomas delayed his retirement by 5 years. I took on extra summer school classes and tutoring. We never told Michael the extent of these sacrifices, not to make him feel guilty, but because that's what parents do. They move heaven and earth to give their children opportunities, and they do it silently, without keeping score. During Michael's sophomore year at Dartmouth, Thomas had his first heart attack. Minor, the doctors assured us, but a warning sign. Michael wanted to take a semester off to come home, but we wouldn't hear of it. "Your job is to study and make the most of this opportunity," Thomas told him firmly from his hospital bed. "My job is to get better. Let's both focus on our assignments." 4 years later, at Michael's graduation, Thomas and I sat in the audience bursting with pride as our son accepted his diploma. We weren't seated in the VIP section like some families. We didn't host an extravagant party at an exclusive restaurant afterward. But that night, in our hotel room, Michael gave us each a letter he'd written, thanking us for everything we'd done to get him to that moment. "I know about the second mortgage," he wrote in mine, "and the extra classes you took on. Dad thinks I don't know, but I do. I'm going to make it all worth it, Mom. I'm going to make you both so proud." I kept that letter in my bedside drawer, through Thomas's second fatal heart attack 5 years later, through the sale of our beloved blue Victorian, through the lonely move to my beige apartment. Sometimes, on particularly difficult nights, I would take it out and read it, tracing my finger over Michael's handwriting, reminding myself that the son who wrote those words still existed somewhere inside the stranger who now kept his distance. The irony doesn't escape me. Michael went to Dartmouth because Thomas and I moved mountains to make it possible. At Dartmouth, he met Jessica, who was completing her undergraduate degree before law school. If we hadn't sacrificed, if we'd chosen the easier path and sent him to state, he might have met someone different, someone who valued family the way we'd taught him to, someone who saw me as an ally rather than an inconvenience. But I wouldn't change our decisions, even knowing the outcome, because every sacrifice, every choice, every moment of putting Michael's needs before our own was made with pure love, the kind of love that doesn't calculate return on investment, the kind of love I thought I was teaching him to recognize, to value, to pass on to his own children someday. As I sit at my kitchen table the morning after being turned away from James's birthday celebration, these memories wash over me like waves, each one a reminder of what was given freely, with open hands and open heart, each one evidence of a bond I thought unbreakable, a connection that transcended time and distance and circumstance. Each one now called into question by a son who allows his mother to stand in the rain, unwelcome and unwanted, while his child calls for her. I touched the gold locket around my neck, Thomas's last gift to me before he died. Inside are 2 tiny photos, Thomas on our wedding day and Michael as a newborn, 2 loves that defined my life, one taken by the cruelty of fate, the other slipping away for reasons I still can't fully comprehend. The tea kettle whistles, pulling me from my reverie. I rise to silence it, my body moving automatically through the familiar routine, while my mind remains trapped in the past, in memories of a life built on sacrifice and love, a foundation I thought was solid enough to support generations to come. I was wrong. The call came 3 weeks after the birthday incident, on a Tuesday morning while I was preparing for story hour at the library. Linda's name flashed on my phone screen, and I answered with my hands full of puppet props for The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Eleanor. Linda's voice was tight, controlled in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. Are you sitting down? You need to sit down. What's happened? My mind raced to the worst possibilities. Michael in an accident. Something wrong with baby James. It's Jessica's mother, Vivian. Linda paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. She's organizing some kind of baby shower. A second one, apparently. For James. But he's 9 months old, I said, confused. Baby showers are before the birth. It's being called a first-year celebration. Very exclusive from what I hear. Catered by that French place in Springfield. Professional photographer. Custom decorations. Another pause. Eleanor. Robert and Sarah got an invitation yesterday. So did their kids. So did I. The implication hung in the air between us. Everyone in the Mitchell family had been invited except me, James's only grandmother on his father's side. There must be some mistake, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew there wasn't. Maybe mine is delayed in the mail. It was an electronic invitation, Linda replied gently. Sarah showed it to me. It's this Saturday at the Davis house in Hartford. Eleanor, I won't go. None of us will go. It's beyond cruel, but I couldn't let them do that. No, you should all go. James should have his family there, even if I can't be. My voice broke on the last words, and I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a sob. The children's librarian glanced over at me with concern, from where she was arranging tiny chairs in a circle. Eleanor, Linda began, but I cut her off. Please, Linda, go and take pictures for me. Tell me how big he's getting, if he's walking yet, if he has more teeth than in the last Instagram photo. Just be there for him, since I can't be. After we hung up, I went to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, breathing deeply, pressing cool paper towels against my swollen eyes. I had a job to do, 20 preschoolers waiting for their story. I couldn't fall apart now. Somehow I made it through story hour. I did all the voices for the caterpillar, the fox, the grouchy ladybug. I led the children in songs, helped them glue tissue paper onto butterfly shapes, smiled at their mothers and grandmothers who watched from the back of the room, all while feeling as though my heart was being slowly crushed in a vice. At home that evening, I found myself staring at Jessica's Instagram account. I didn't follow her directly. She had blocked me months ago, but I could still see her public posts through a secondary account I'd created, a fact I was deeply ashamed of. There it was, a series of photos showcasing the elaborate preparations for what was being called James's milestone celebration. Custom printed banners with his name and photo, gift tables already piled high with elegantly wrapped packages, a professional cake designer putting the finishing touches on a 3-tiered masterpiece that looked more appropriate for a wedding than a baby's party. And then I saw it, in the background of one photo, partially visible but unmistakable, a large framed portrait of Jessica holding James, her parents standing proudly behind them. No Michael in the photo, and certainly no acknowledgement of James's paternal heritage. The Mitchell side, my side, conspicuously absent. I closed the app, feeling sick. This wasn't just about excluding me from a party. This was systematic erasure. Jessica was creating a narrative for James that minimized or completely removed his connection to half of his family, half of his identity. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day for a celebration. I tried to keep busy, attacking my small apartment with a ferocity that surprised me. I scrubbed the bathroom until my hands were raw, reorganized my bookshelves by color instead of author, vacuumed corners that hadn't seen daylight in months. Anything to keep from thinking about the party happening 2 hours away, about Linda and Robert and their families gathering without me, about Jessica's triumph in dividing the Mitchells. My phone pinged with occasional updates from Linda. James is walking, holding onto furniture but taking a few steps. He has 4 teeth now and the sweetest little laugh. Each message a gift and a knife wound simultaneously. Around 3 o'clock, the messages stopped. I assumed the party was in full swing, everyone too busy enjoying themselves to text. I made myself a cup of tea and tried to focus on grading papers for the GED class I taught twice a week at the community center. But the words swam before my eyes. The doorbell rang at 4:17 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a wild moment, I fantasized that it might be Michael, having realized the injustice of my exclusion, coming to apologize and make amends. Instead, when I opened the door, I found a young man in a delivery uniform holding a large white bakery box. "Eleanor Mitchell?" he asked, consulting his clipboard. "Yes, that's me," I replied, confused. "Delivery for you. Need you to sign here." He thrust the clipboard toward me. Inside my apartment, I placed the mysterious box on my kitchen counter and carefully lifted the lid. Inside was a cake, or rather, what remained of one. It had clearly once been beautiful, with delicate blue frosting and silver edible pearls, but now it was smashed, as if someone had pressed a hand down into its center. Across the ruined surface, someone had written in messy red frosting, "World's worst grandma." My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, staring at the destruction before me. Who would do such a thing? Jessica, obviously. But would Michael have allowed it? Did he know? Was this his idea of a joke? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. I had never deleted her number, though she hadn't called me directly in over 8 months. With trembling fingers, I answered. "Did you get your special delivery?" Her voice was slurred slightly, as if she'd been drinking. "I thought you should have a piece of the celebration, Eleanor, since you're so desperate to be involved." "Jessica," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" "Why?" She laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Because you need to understand your place. Or rather, your lack of one. Michael has finally seen you for what you really are. A manipulative, controlling, small-minded woman who can't let go. Who can't accept that your son has outgrown you and your pathetic little world." In the background, I could hear music and voices, the party continuing without interruption, while this cruel drama played out. "Where's Michael?" I asked, struggling to maintain composure. "Does he know you're calling me?" "Michael," Jessica said his name with exaggerated care, "is busy with important people. People who matter. People who can help his career, unlike his community college teacher mother." The deliberate inaccuracy, I'd taught at a respected public high school, not a community college, was just another twist of the knife, another attempt to diminish me and my contributions. "And just so we're clear," Jessica continued, her voice hardening, "the only reason Linda and Robert and the rest of your little family were invited today was to show them what they can have access to if they follow our rules. If they understand that you're the problem, not us." "The problem?" I repeated, my confusion genuine despite the growing horror in my chest. "What have I done, Jessica? What could I possibly have done to deserve this treatment?" "You existed," she hissed, the veneer of control finally cracking. "You and your constant presence, your expectations, your judgment, your little comments about my parenting, the way you look at me when I discipline James, the Mitchell family traditions you keep pushing, as if your mediocre upbringing of Michael is something to be replicated. I began, but she cut me off. "I don't owe you explanations, Eleanor. I don't owe you anything, and neither does Michael. He's made his choice, and it's me. It's us. Me, James, and my family. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone. Let me talk to him," I pleaded. "Please, Jessica, just let me speak to my son." There was a rustling sound, and then, to my shock, Michael's voice came on the line. "Mom, Michael," I gasped, tears flowing freely now. "Michael, please. What's happening? Why is Jessica sending me destroyed cakes? Why am I not welcome at my own grandson's celebration?" There was a long pause, and when he finally spoke, his voice was distant, formal. "Mom, we've talked about this. You need to respect our boundaries. Jessica feels uncomfortable around you, and as her husband, it's my job to support her. James is our child, and we get to decide who's part of his life. But I'm your mother," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I raised you. I loved you every moment of your life. How can you cut me out this way? How can you allow this cruelty?" Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Then Michael sighed heavily. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Jessica told me about the messages you've been sending her parents, the things you've been saying about her to the family. It needs to stop, Mom. We can revisit this situation in the future if you can demonstrate that you've changed. But for now, I think it's best if we maintain distance." "Messages?" I echoed, completely lost. "Michael, I've never sent anything to Jessica's parents. I barely know them." "Who told you that I had?" But Michael had already hung up, leaving me alone with my confusion, my grief, and a destroyed cake, proclaiming me the world's worst grandma. I sat on my kitchen floor until the light faded from the windows and the apartment grew dark around me. The cake sat on the counter, a monument to my humiliation, to the calculated cruelty of a woman who had decided I was her enemy for reasons I still couldn't fully comprehend, and to the betrayal of a son who chose to believe the worst of his mother without evidence, without explanation, without the courtesy of a conversation. Later, after I'd finally found the strength to throw the cake away and wash the sticky residue from my hands, I received one final text from Linda. "It was awful without you." Jessica kept making pointed remarks about toxic influences and protecting James from negativity. Michael looked miserable, but didn't contradict her. "Robert and I left early. Call me tomorrow. I love you." I crawled into bed fully dressed, too exhausted to even change into pajamas. The ceiling above me blurred through my tears as I stared upward, searching for answers in the shadows. What messages was Jessica claiming I'd sent? What lies had she told Michael to turn him against me so completely? And how had my sweet boy, the child I'd raised to be kind and fair and loyal, become someone who would allow his mother to be treated this way? Sleep evaded me as these questions circled endlessly, finding no resolution. In the darkest hour of the night, a new, terrible thought surfaced. What if this was permanent? What if Jessica had permanently poisoned my relationship with Michael? What if I never got to be a real grandmother to James? The panic that accompanied these thoughts was overwhelming, a physical pressure in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I curled onto my side, hugging my knees to my chest like a child, and finally let the sobs come, deep, primal sounds that seemed to rise from the very core of my being. I cried for the little boy who had once looked at me as if I hung the moon and stars. I cried for the man who now couldn't even defend me against blatant cruelty. I cried for baby James, growing up without knowing how fiercely he was loved by the grandmother he was being taught to forget. And somewhere in that storm of grief, as the first pale light of dawn crept around the edges of my curtains, something shifted inside me. A tiny seed of something other than sorrow took root. Not quite anger, not yet, but a realization, clear and cold as morning dew. This could not continue. I could not continue this way, allowing myself to be erased, to be vilified, to be destroyed piece by piece. For the first time since Thomas died, since Michael had begun pulling away, since Jessica had started her campaign to remove me from their lives, I felt a flicker of something resembling determination. If Michael wouldn't come to me, I would go to him. Not to beg, not to plead, but to demand the truth. To look my son in the eyes and ask him directly, "What lies have you been told about me? And why, after a lifetime of love and sacrifice, did you choose to believe them without question?" The humiliation of the ruined cake, the cruelty of the phone call, the pain of exclusion, all of it crystallized into a single burning resolve. Enough was enough. Something had to change, and if no one else would initiate that change, then it would have to be me. It took 3 days before I could bring myself to leave my apartment after the cake incident. 3 days of ignoring Linda's increasingly concerned calls, of staring at the ceiling, of replaying every interaction with Jessica, searching for the moment when things had gone so irreparably wrong. On the 4th day, I forced myself to shower, to dress in something other than pajamas, to make a proper meal instead of surviving on crackers and tea. Small acts of self-preservation that felt monumental in their difficulty, but necessary if I was going to survive this, if I was going to find a way forward. I called Linda back, apologized for worrying her, and listened as she filled in more details about the milestone celebration and its aftermath. Jessica was working the room like a politician, Linda told me, disgust evident in her voice. Telling everyone how unfortunate the situation with you was, how concerned she and Michael were about your unstable behavior. When Sarah asked directly why you weren't invited, Jessica actually teared up, I swear, Eleanor, actual crocodile tears, and said something about respecting their boundaries and repeated incidents that made you unsafe to have around James. Unsafe? I echoed, the word hitting me like a physical blow. She called me unsafe? Robert nearly walked out right then, Linda continued, but he wanted to talk to Michael first, get his side of the story. He cornered him by the bar, asked him point blank what was going on. Eleanor, Michael wouldn't look him in the eye, just kept saying it was complicated and that there were issues you're not aware of, issues I wasn't aware of, repeated incidents, messages to Jessica's parents. None of it made sense, yet all of it was being used to paint me as some kind of threat, someone who needed to be kept away from her own grandson. There's something else, Linda said, hesitation in her voice. Sarah overheard Jessica on the phone with someone, talking about you. She said something about the plan working perfectly, and she'll never figure it out. A cold clarity began to seep through my confusion. This wasn't just Jessica being possessive or territorial. This wasn't just a personality clash or a difficult daughter-in-law situation. This was deliberate, strategic. Jessica was systematically isolating Michael from his family, from me specifically, using tactics I couldn't even begin to understand. But why? What could she possibly gain from destroying my relationship with my son? The question haunted me as I tried to resume some semblance of normal life. I returned to my volunteer work at the library, taught my GED classes, went through the motions of daily existence. But inside, something had fundamentally changed. The shock and hurt were still there, yes, but they were now accompanied by a growing sense of determination, a need to understand what was happening and why. 1 week after the cake delivery, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, Robert's wife, rang my doorbell on a Saturday morning, looking nervous but resolved. "I can't stay long," she said, as I ushered her into my small living room. "Robert doesn't know I'm here. None of them do. But I couldn't let this continue without saying something. Sarah and I had always been friendly, but never particularly close. She was younger than me by nearly 15 years, more a contemporary of Michael's generation than mine. To have her show up unannounced spoke volumes about the seriousness of what she had to share. "It's about Jessica," she began, perching on the edge of my sofa. "There's something not right about her, Eleanor. The way she's manipulating everyone. The things she's saying about you when you're not there to defend yourself." "What kinds of things?" I asked, bracing myself for more pain. Sarah hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I recorded part of a conversation at the party. I know it wasn't the most ethical thing to do, but I had this feeling. This terrible feeling that someone needed to document what was happening." She pressed play, and Jessica's voice filled my small living room, smooth and controlled, addressing what sounded like a small group. Really the hardest decision we've ever had to make. Michael was devastated, of course. Who wouldn't be? But after the incident with the baby, we just couldn't take any more chances. The doctors said James was fine, thankfully, but when someone shows such disregard for an infant's safety, especially someone with Eleanor's history of issues, well, we have to put our child first, don't we? My blood ran cold. Incident with the baby? What incident? I've barely been allowed to hold James since he was born. Sarah stopped the recording, her face grave. "That's just it, Eleanor. There was no incident. Jessica is making it up. She's creating this fictional narrative about you being dangerous or unstable, and she's selling it to everyone who will listen. But why would Michael allow that?" I asked, the question that had been tormenting me for months. "He knows me. He knows I would never harm a child, let alone my own grandson." Sarah's expression softened with pity. "I don't think Michael knows what she's saying. At least not all of it. Jessica's careful about what she says when he's in earshot versus when he's not around. And I think she's been manipulating his perceptions for a long time, planting seeds of doubt, reframing his memories, isolating him gradually so her version of reality becomes his only reference point. The term came to me suddenly, from an article I'd read years ago. Gaslighting. She's gaslighting him, and by extension, gaslighting the entire family about me. Sarah nodded slowly. I think so, yes. And it's been happening for longer than any of us realized. Robert and I have been talking about it a lot since the party. The way Michael has changed over the years. The way he seems uncertain of himself around Jessica, always looking to her for approval or direction. The way he repeats phrases that sound nothing like him, like he's been coached. My mind raced back through the past 4 years, seeing patterns I'd missed or dismissed. The gradual withdrawal after he and Jessica became serious. The increasing formality in our interactions. The way he would start to tell a childhood story, then stop and correct himself, as if he'd been told his memories were wrong. But why? I asked again, the central question I couldn't resolve. Why would she go to such lengths to turn Michael against me? What does she gain? Sarah looked down at her hands. Control, maybe. Some people need to be the only influence in their partner's life. Or maybe it's about James, about ensuring she has the only say in how he's raised. I don't know, Eleanor, but I do know it's not right, and it's not your fault. After Sarah left, promising to stay in touch and to keep me informed of any developments, I sat in silence for a long time, processing everything she had shared, the calculated nature of Jessica's campaign against me, the deliberate lies about incidents that never happened, the way she presented different versions of reality depending on who was listening. For months, years, really, I had been blaming myself, wondering what I had done wrong, how I had failed as a mother, what fatal mistake had cost me my relationship with my son and access to my grandson. I had accepted Jessica's narrative without question, that I was the problem, that I was the one who needed to change, that my exclusion was a natural consequence of my own shortcomings. But what if that wasn't true? What if I had been set up to fail from the beginning, positioned as an adversary in a game whose rules I didn't understand, fighting an opponent I didn't even know I had? That night, I dreamed of Thomas. We were in our old blue Victorian, in the kitchen where we'd spent so many evenings talking over cups of tea after Michael had gone to bed. Dream Thomas looked exactly as he had in those days. Salt and pepper hair, laugh lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin from a childhood bicycle accident. "You've been letting them define you, Ellie," he said, using the nickname that always made me feel most myself. "You've been accepting their version of who you are." I didn't know what else to do, I told him. And even in the dream, I could feel the weight of my grief and confusion. I thought if I just tried harder, if I just gave them more space, Michael would remember. He would come back. Thomas shook his head, his expression gentle but firm. "That's not how this works, love. You can't just disappear and hope they'll appreciate you when you're gone. You need to stand up. You need to be who you really are, not who Jessica says you are." "And who am I?" I asked him, suddenly desperate for the answer. His smile was warm, familiar, the one he reserved just for me. "You're Eleanor Mitchell. You're the woman who faced down the school board when they tried to ban Toni Morrison from the curriculum. You're the woman who drove through a blizzard to get Michael to the hospital when he broke his arm sledding. You're the woman I fell in love with because she never backed down when it mattered." I woke with tears on my face, but a strange sense of peace in my heart. Thomas was right, even if he was just a creation of my subconscious. I had been allowing myself to be defined by Jessica's lies, by Michael's rejection, by my own fear of losing them completely if I dared to challenge the narrative. But that approach hadn't worked. Being small, being accommodating, being endlessly patient while hoping for change, it had only emboldened Jessica and pushed Michael further away. If I wanted any chance of reclaiming my relationship with my son and having a place in my grandson's life, I needed to stand up. I needed to fight back, not with Jessica's weapons of manipulation and deceit, but with the truth. The next morning, I called in sick to my volunteer shift at the library, something I had never done before, and sat down at my small kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. I began to write, methodically documenting everything I could remember about the progression of events from when Michael first introduced me to Jessica to the present day. Every interaction, every conversation, every perceived slight or misunderstanding. I noted when things began to change, when Michael's behavior toward me shifted, when Jessica began to exert more control over their relationship. I wrote for hours, filling page after page. Some memories brought fresh tears, others sparked anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. By the time I finished, the sky outside my window had darkened to dusk, and my hand was cramped from writing. Looking at the chronicle I'd created, certain patterns became clear. Jessica's campaign hadn't been sudden. It had been gradual, methodical. A comment here about my parenting choices, a reinterpretation there of a shared memory, a subtle repositioning of me from beloved mother to problematic influence, always with plausible deniability, always with just enough truth mixed in to make the lies digestible. And Michael, my sensitive, loyal boy who had always sought harmony above conflict, had been the perfect target. He wouldn't have recognized the manipulation for what it was. He would have interpreted his own discomfort as a sign that something was indeed wrong, that Jessica's concerns must have merit, that his mother must be the source of the tension he felt. The realization broke my heart all over again, but this time, the pain was accompanied by clarity. This wasn't just about me and my hurt feelings. This was about Michael, being isolated from his support system and manipulated into rejecting his own mother. This was about James, being denied a relationship with his grandmother based on lies. This was about a family being torn apart by one person's need for control. For the first time in years, I felt something like my old self stirring. The Eleanor who had marched in protests in her college days, who had stood up to school administrators trying to water down the curriculum, who had faced down medical bureaucracy when Thomas was sick to ensure he got the care he needed. The Eleanor who didn't back down when it mattered, just as Thomas had said in my dream. I couldn't force Michael to see the truth. I couldn't make Jessica stop her campaign against me, but I could refuse to play by their rules any longer. I could reject the role of villain I'd been assigned without my consent. I could stand in my own truth, even if I stood there alone. The next day, I made another decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I called a therapist whose name I'd received months ago from a concerned Linda but had never contacted. I made an appointment for the following week, acknowledging that I needed professional support to navigate this situation, to separate legitimate self-reflection from the gaslighting I'd been subjected to find healthy ways forward that wouldn't inadvertently make the situation worse. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because anything had actually changed in my external circumstances. Michael still wasn't speaking to me. Jessica was still spreading lies. I was still cut off from James. But because something fundamental had shifted within me. I was awake now. I saw the situation for what it was. And while I didn't yet know exactly how to proceed, I knew I would no longer be a passive participant in my own erasure. I would no longer absorb blame that wasn't mine to carry. I would no longer question my worth as a mother, as a grandmother, as a person deserving of basic respect and honesty. The Eleanor who had been sleepwalking through pain for years had finally opened her eyes. And once you've truly awakened, there's no going back to the comfortable numbness of sleep, no matter how tempting it might sometimes be. 3 weeks after my conversation with Sarah, I received an unexpected email from an unfamiliar address. Davis, familyofficeedgemail.com. The subject line read simply, regarding Michael and Jessica. My finger hovered over the delete button. After everything that had happened, I was wary of anything connected to the Davis family, but curiosity won out, and I opened it with a racing heart. Dear Eleanor, it began. You don't know me, but I worked as a personal assistant to Vivian and George Davis, Jessica's parents, for 7 years, until my position was terminated last month. There are things you should know about your situation with Michael and Jessica, things I've witnessed firsthand that keep me awake at night. I can no longer be complicit in what they're doing to you and to your son. Can we meet in person? This isn't a conversation for email. Marissa Turner. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading the message. It could be a trap. Another cruel trick from Jessica to further humiliate me. Or it could be legitimate. Someone from inside the Davis inner circle reaching out with information I desperately needed. After careful consideration, I replied, suggesting we meet at a public cafe in Albany, halfway between my home and Hartford, where Marissa indicated she still lived. I chose a location I knew well, where the owner was a former student of mine who would watch out for me if anything seemed amiss. 2 days later, I sat at a corner table in Benny's Coffee House. nervously shredding a napkin as I waited. At precisely 2 p.m., a young woman entered, early 30s, professionally dressed with a serious expression that suggested she wasn't taking this meeting lightly either. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Marissa." She extended her hand, and I noticed she wore no rings, no jewelry at all except for simple pearl earrings. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." After we both ordered, tea for me, black coffee for her, Marissa got straight to the point. I worked directly for Vivian Davis, handling her correspondence, managing her social calendar, and occasionally assisting with various family matters. I was privy to conversations and situations most people outside the family never see. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. The Davises aren't who they appear to be in public. There's a darkness there, especially with Vivian and Jessica. "What kind of darkness?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite my pounding heart. Marissa looked down at her coffee. "Control, manipulation, a ruthlessness about getting what they want, no matter who gets hurt in the process. I've seen it happen to others before you. People who get in their way or who have something they want. They get systematically pushed out, discredited, destroyed. But what do they want from me? I'm just a retired teacher. I don't have money or influence or anything else that would be valuable to them. You have Michael," Marissa said simply. "And by extension, you have influence over James. Jessica doesn't share power, Ms. Mitchell. Not with anyone. And a grandmother, especially one with a strong bond with her son, represents a competing source of influence that she can't tolerate." It made a terrible kind of sense, aligning with what I'd begun to suspect myself. But hearing it confirmed by someone who knew the Davis family intimately still felt like a blow. "There's more," Marissa continued, lowering her voice though no one was seated near us. "I have evidence. Documentation of what they've been doing to undermine you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table to me. "These are copies. I kept the originals somewhere safe, in case they come after me for this. The Davises don't respond well to betrayal." With trembling hands, I opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, screenshots of text messages, and several handwritten notes on Vivian Davis's personal stationery. As I began to read, my blood ran cold. The first email was from Jessica to her mother, dated about 3 years ago, shortly after she and Michael had become engaged. "He's still too attached to his mother. Every decision, he wants her input. Every story from his childhood includes her. It's like he can't conceptualize his identity, separate from being Eleanor's son. We need to create some distance there, if this is going to work long term. I can't build the family I want with him if he's still emotionally tethered to her." The next was a response from Vivian. "Darling, this is exactly what we discussed. Start small. Question his memories gently. Are you sure that's how it happened? Plant seeds of doubt about her motives. I wonder why she really said that. Create situations where she can be perceived as overstepping, then react with hurt feelings. Men like Michael, sensitive, loyal, are actually the easiest to work with. They'll do anything to avoid causing pain to someone they love. Just make sure he believes he's protecting you from her, not the other way around." I felt physically ill as I continued reading through the correspondence, watching the calculated destruction of my relationship with my son documented in clinical detail. Jessica reporting progress to her mother as Michael began to distance himself from me. Vivian suggesting specific tactics. Isolation from other family members who might contradict the narrative. Rewriting of childhood memories to emphasize negative aspects. Strategic use of the pregnancy. And then baby James as leverage. But it was the more recent messages that truly shattered me. Emails between Jessica and her father discussing the False Allegations Project, as they called it. Detailed plans to create a fictional incident involving me and baby James that would justify cutting me off completely. Screenshots of messages they had fabricated to make it appear I was sending harassing communications to the Davis family, using a spoofed email address and phone number. They made it look like I was threatening them, I whispered, horror washing over me. That I hurt James? Marissa nodded grimly. It's a technique they've used before. Create evidence of wrongdoing, then use it to justify the isolation they already wanted to impose. By the time I realized what was happening with your situation specifically, they had already convinced Michael that you had sent threatening messages and that you had been negligent with the baby during one of your few supervised visits. But none of that happened. I was never even alone with James. I know, Marissa said quietly. That's why I'm here. That's why I saved these documents before I left. What they're doing isn't just cruel, it's potentially criminal. Fabricating evidence, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what I was learning. This wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law situation or a personality clash. This was a coordinated campaign to destroy my relationship with my son using calculated psychological manipulation and outright fraud. "Why are you helping me?" I asked finally. "You said they terminated your position. Is this about revenge?" Marissa's expression hardened. "They didn't just fire me, Ms. Mitchell. They attempted to blacklist me throughout my industry. They threatened to sue me for invented breaches of confidentiality if I applied for jobs with any of their connections. They even contacted my landlord claiming I had damaged their property while working in their home, nearly causing me to be evicted." She paused, visibly gathering her composure. "So yes, there's an element of wanting justice for myself, but it's more than that." She reached across the table, briefly touching my hand, a gesture of unexpected solidarity. "My grandmother raised me after my mother died. She was everything to me. The thought of someone deliberately separating a grandmother from her grandchild, using lies and manipulation. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help." Tears welled in my eyes at this unexpected alliance, this stranger who understood the depth of what had been stolen from me. "There's one more thing you should know," Marissa said, her voice dropping even lower. "Vivian has been putting pressure on Michael professionally. George Davis has connections at the architectural firm where Michael works. They've been dangling promotions, client introductions, potential partnerships, all contingent on Michael maintaining appropriate family boundaries, which is their code for keeping you at a distance." The final piece clicked into place. Michael's inexplicable career advancement over the past 2 years, the sudden influx of high-profile projects, the new house in a neighborhood they shouldn't have been able to afford on his normal salary, and Jessica's entry-level attorney income. "They bought him," I whispered. "They literally bought my son's loyalty." "Not completely," Marissa replied, a hint of hope in her voice. "From what I observed, Michael still struggles with the situation. There have been arguments, Jessica complaining to her mother that Michael gets emotional about you, that he questions their narrative sometimes. That's why they had to escalate to fabricating evidence. His natural instinct to maintain a relationship with you was too strong to break with just subtle manipulation." I closed the folder, my mind racing with the implications of everything I'd learned. What do I do with this information? If I confront Michael directly, he's been conditioned to disbelieve anything I say against Jessica. If I try to use these documents legally, the Davises have unlimited resources to fight me in court. "I can't tell you what to do," Marissa said carefully. "But I will say this. The Davises' power comes from secrecy, from controlling the narrative, from isolating their targets so no one compares notes. The fact that you're now aware of what's happening, that's already a significant change in the dynamic." We talked for another hour, Marissa filling in more details about the Davis family's patterns and tactics. By the time we parted, exchanging phone numbers with promises to stay in touch, my mind was made up. I couldn't continue living in reaction to Jessica's machinations. I needed to reclaim my agency, my voice, my relationship with my son, but I needed to be strategic about it. On the drive home, I called Linda and asked her to gather Robert and the rest of the family for a meeting at my apartment the following evening. "It's important," I told her. "I have information everyone needs to hear." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder of evidence spread before me, formulating a plan. Not a scheme of revenge or exposure that would ultimately hurt Michael and James, but a careful strategy to break through the web of lies that had entrapped my son. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of power returning, not over others, but over my own life, my own story. I had been cast as the villain in Jessica's narrative, but I was not obligated to play that role. I had been portrayed as dangerous, unstable, manipulative, but those labels belonged to their creators, not to me. I thought of Thomas, of what he would advise if he were here. He had always been the strategist in our relationship, the one who could see 3 moves ahead, while I was still reacting to what was right in front of me. "Don't fight on their terrain, Ellie," he would say when I faced conflicts at school. "Choose the battlefield that plays to your strengths, not theirs." The Davises operated through isolation, secrecy, and one-on-one manipulation. My strength had always been in community. in open communication, in the authentic relationships I'd built over decades of living truthfully. Jessica had been playing chess while I didn't even know we were in a game. But now, finally, I could see the board, understand the pieces, recognize the strategy being employed against me, and I was done being a pawn. The family meeting in my apartment the next evening was solemn and focused. Linda and her husband, Robert and Sarah, Thomas's sister Catherine, who had flown in from Colorado after my urgent call, all sat in my small living room, expressions grave as I shared what Marissa had revealed. I passed around copies of the most damning documents, the emails outlining the campaign against me, the evidence of fabricated messages, the strategic deployment of baby James as emotional leverage. Their reactions ranged from horrified gasps to white-knuckled fury. "We need to confront them," Robert said, his voice tight with anger. Thomas's younger brother had always been the most impulsive of the Mitchells. "Take this to Michael directly. Show him what they've been doing." "No," I said firmly, surprising everyone, including myself, with my certainty. Direct confrontation plays into their hands. They've already conditioned Michael to disbelieve anything negative about Jessica, to see any criticism of her as an attack. If we charge in with accusations, they'll just use it to prove their narrative that I'm trying to undermine their marriage. "So what do we do?" Linda asked, her practical nature seeking concrete steps. "We can't just let them continue this psychological warfare against you, against all of us. We build a case Michael can't ignore," I said, laying out the strategy I'd been developing since meeting with Marissa. Not through direct accusations, but through inconsistencies in their narrative that he'll have to reconcile for himself. We create openings for truth, not confrontations about lies. Over the next 2 hours, we developed a coordinated approach. Catherine, as someone who'd had limited contact with Jessica and wasn't part of the immediate conflict, would reach out to Michael under the pretext of being in town for a conference. Her role would be to casually mention seeing me, noting that I seemed nothing like what he'd described in their recent conversations, planting the first seed of doubt about the unstable, manipulative image of me Jessica had cultivated. Robert, who had business connections with several clients at Michael's architectural firm, would make inquiries about the Davis family's influence there, documenting any unusual patterns of favoritism or pressure. Linda would reach out to her son Ethan, Michael's once inseparable cousin, to resurrect their relationship and create another channel to Michael outside Jessica's control. And Sarah, who had already begun building a record of Jessica's contradictory statements about me at family gatherings, would continue documenting these inconsistencies, creating a timeline that would eventually reveal the calculated nature of the campaign against me. "What about you, Eleanor?" Catherine asked, concern evident in her eyes. "What will you be doing while we're laying this groundwork?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what I knew would be the most challenging part of our plan. "I'm going to do something that will be very difficult for me," I admitted. "I'm going to live my life as if this crushing pain isn't consuming me every day. I'm going to present to the world, and to Michael, whenever our paths cross, the image of a woman who is sad about the distance from her son, but not destroyed by it. A woman who maintains her dignity, her interests, her connections to community. A woman who is nothing like the desperate, manipulative figure Jessica has painted me to be." The strategy was multi-layered. First, by visibly thriving despite Jessica's efforts to crush me, I would contradict her narrative about my psychological state. Second, by refusing to act in the desperate, clingy ways she had described to Michael, I would create cognitive dissonance for him, a gap between what he'd been told about me and what he could observe with his own eyes. And third, by redirecting my energy toward positive pursuits, rather than just reactive suffering, I would preserve my own mental health through what promised to be a difficult process. "That's remarkably strategic," Robert said, looking at me with newfound respect. "And incredibly difficult. Are you sure you can do it?" I thought of the therapy sessions I'd begun, of the clarity that had emerged from acknowledging the manipulation I'd endured. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but I know I have to try. Not just for Michael and James, but for myself. I can't keep living as a character in Jessica's story. I need to reclaim my own." After my family left, each with their assigned roles in our careful counter-strategy, I sat alone in my quiet apartment, feeling strangely peaceful despite the enormity of what lay ahead. This wasn't about revenge or even justice in the conventional sense. It was about truth, creating space for it to emerge, for Michael to see it for himself without being backed into a defensive posture. The next morning, I began implementing my part of the plan. I called Diane, the director of the Millfield Public Library, and accepted the paid position she'd been offering me for months, coordinating their adult literacy program. I contacted my old colleague from the high school about co-teaching a creative writing workshop for seniors at the community center. I rejoined the local theater group I'd abandoned after Thomas died, signing up to help with costume design for their summer production. Each action was deliberate, creating a life filled with purpose and connection. A life that directly contradicted Jessica's portrayal of me as isolated, bitter, and obsessed with inserting myself into her family. I updated my long-neglected social media accounts with photos of these activities, knowing that Michael still occasionally checked them, according to Linda. I also began a careful process of reconnecting with old friends who had known Michael throughout his childhood, teachers who had mentored him, parents of his school friends, our former neighbors from the Blue Victorian, not to recruit them into some campaign against Jessica, but to reactivate the network of people who could serve as gentle reminders of the reality of Michael's childhood, the reality Jessica had worked so hard to rewrite. 3 weeks into our strategy, the first small breakthrough came. Catherine called after her chance meeting with Michael for coffee during her fabricated conference visit. "He seemed genuinely confused when I mentioned seeing you," she reported. "I just said something casual like, 'I had lunch with your mom yesterday. She seemed so well, really thriving with that new position at the library.' And Eleanor," he actually did a double take. He said, "Mom took a job?" Like it was the most surprising thing he'd ever heard. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, trying not to let hope rise too quickly. "He asked if you seemed happy. I told him you seemed centered, purposeful, that you spoke about him and James with love, but not desperation, that you mentioned understanding his need for space while still holding hope for reconciliation someday." Catherine paused. "Eleanor." He got tears in his eyes. Just for a moment, but they were there. Then he changed the subject. A small crack in the facade. The first hint that the image of me Jessica had constructed in Michael's mind didn't fully align with what others observed. Not enough to change anything yet, but a beginning. A week later, Linda reported that her son Ethan had successfully reconnected with Michael through a professional networking event, deliberately engineered by Robert. They had made plans to meet for drinks, just the two of them, a boys' night reminiscent of their close childhood friendship. Ethan says Michael seemed almost relieved to have a connection to family that didn't come with all the baggage of the current situation, Linda told me. Like he's been missing us, but didn't know how to bridge the gap Jessica created. Meanwhile, Robert's discreet inquiries into the Davis family's influence at Michael's firm had yielded concerning information. George Davis had indeed leveraged his connections to secure Michael high-profile projects and accelerated promotions, but with strings attached. Several colleagues mentioned overhearing tense phone conversations between Michael and his father-in-law, suggesting the relationship wasn't as smoothly beneficial as it appeared from the outside. Slowly, methodically, we were building a mosaic of truth around Michael, not confronting him with it directly, but placing pieces where he would naturally encounter them, allowing him to assemble the picture himself. The most difficult part for me was maintaining my resolve not to reach out to him directly. Every day, I composed emails and text messages in my mind, drafted and redrafted pleas for understanding, explanations of what I discovered. Every night I reminded myself why direct communication wouldn't work, how it would trigger the defensive mechanisms Jessica had installed, how it would play into her narrative about my inability to respect boundaries. Instead, I channeled that energy into living visibly well. I posted photos of the library's successful literacy fundraiser I'd organized. I shared updates about the community theater production, including a picture of me smiling with the cast, clearly embedded in a supportive social network. I wrote thoughtful comments on Michael's occasional professional posts, offering genuine congratulations on his accomplishments without any hint of the hurt or resentment Jessica would expect. 2 months into our strategy, Sarah provided the most significant development yet. At a family birthday celebration for Robert's youngest daughter, an event Jessica and Michael attended but I tactfully avoided, she had overheard a revealing conversation. Jessica was on the phone in the hallway, arguing with someone. "I think her mother," Sarah reported. She didn't know I was coming up the stairs. She was saying, "It's not working anymore. He's asking questions about her. That cousin is filling his head with old stories, making him nostalgic." And then she said something that chilled me, Eleanor. She said, We might need to accelerate the Boston plan. Get him away from all of them permanently. The Boston plan. A new wave of anxiety washed over me. They're planning to move? The thought of Michael and James relocating even further away, beyond the reach of our careful strategy, was devastating. That's what it sounded like, Sarah confirmed. I tried to learn more, but she spotted me and ended the call immediately. We needed to adjust our timeline. What we'd planned as a gradual process of truth revealing might need to happen more quickly if Jessica was planning to physically remove Michael from our sphere of influence entirely. That night, I did something I'd resisted for months. I opened the folder Marissa had given me and selected the most indisputable evidence of Jessica's manipulation, emails between her and her mother explicitly discussing how to turn Michael against me, screenshots of the fabricated threatening messages they'd created in my name, the detailed plan to invent an incident with baby James that never occurred. I didn't send these directly to Michael. Instead, I created a secure digital archive, accessible with a password, and sent the link and password separately to Ethan, Michael's cousin, with a simple message. This contains information Michael may need someday. Your judgment about if and when to share it with him is the only one I trust completely. It was a safety net, a last resort if Jessica succeeded in cutting Michael off from the family entirely before our more subtle approach could work. I trusted Ethan, who had been like a brother to Michael growing up, to use the information responsibly, to protect Michael, rather than just expose Jessica. With that contingency in place, I returned my focus to the strategy of living visibly, truthfully, in contradiction to Jessica's narrative about me. I continued building my new life, not as a replacement for my relationship with Michael and James, but as a testament to who I really was. Not the villain of Jessica's story, but a woman of resilience, purpose, and enduring love. 3 days later, my doorbell rang at 9:15 p.m., an unusual time for visitors. When I opened it, I found Ethan standing there, his expression grave. I showed him, he said without preamble, stepping inside when I gestured him in. The evidence you sent me. I know it was supposed to be a last resort, but something happened, and I made a judgment call. My heart raced. What happened? Is Michael okay? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Michael as a teenager that it made my chest ache. He called me yesterday, really upset. Apparently Jessica has been pushing hard for this move to Boston, a fresh start away from negative influences in Springfield. When he hesitated, suggesting they at least wait until after James's first birthday, she exploded, said some things about you that even Michael found extreme. It created a fight, their worst one yet. He paused, letting me absorb this information before continuing. He called me because he needed someone to talk to who knew both of you and Jessica. He said he felt like he was going crazy, like there were two completely different versions of reality and he couldn't reconcile them. So I made the decision to show him what you'd sent me. The room seemed to tilt slightly as I processed what this meant. How did he react? Ethan's expression softened. He was shocked, then disbelieving, then devastated. He recognized Jessica's writing style in the emails immediately. He knew they were real. He kept saying, "This can't be happening. And how could I have let this happen?" I sank onto the sofa, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Relief that Michael now knew the truth. Horror at the pain this revelation must be causing him. Fear about what would happen next. "Where is he now?" I asked, the maternal instinct to protect my child, even my adult child, surging to the forefront. "At a hotel," Ethan said. He couldn't stay in the house with her after what he learned. He said he needs time to think, to figure out what to do. He hesitated, then added, "He asked about you, Eleanor. Wanted to know if you were okay, what you'd been doing these past months." I told him about the library job, the community theater, how you've been living your life with dignity despite everything. He just kept nodding, like pieces were finally falling into place. Did he say, "Does he want to see me?" The question caught in my throat, years of hurt and hope colliding. "He's not ready yet," Ethan said gently. "He's overwhelmed, trying to process his own role in what happened to you. The guilt is crushing him, but he did ask me to tell you something. If I saw you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He wrote it down because he wanted to get the words exactly right. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note, instantly recognizing Michael's handwriting. "Mom, I don't know how to begin to make this right. I failed you in every way a son can fail a mother. I believed lies about the person who has always been true to me. I have a lot to figure out now. About Jessica, about our future, about how to protect James from all of this. But I want you to know, I remember everything you and Dad taught me about family, about loyalty, about love. The fog is lifting. I hope someday you can forgive me. Michael. The tears came then, silent and cleansing, washing away months of bewilderment and pain. Not tears of complete resolution. We had a long road ahead, but tears of recognition. My son was finding his way back to himself, to the truth, to me. Jessica's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, her power diminishing with every piece of evidence Michael absorbed. The woman who had tried to erase me from my son's life had only succeeded temporarily. The bonds of genuine love and shared history were proving stronger than her manipulation. As Ethan left with a promise to keep me updated on Michael's state of mind, I stood in my doorway looking up at the night sky, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't, not yet. But because truth had finally broken through. The light was beginning to shine into the dark corners where lies had flourished. I didn't know exactly what would happen next with Michael, with Jessica, with little James. But I knew that whatever came, I would face it as my authentic self, not as the villain in someone else's story, but as Eleanor Mitchell, mother, grandmother, survivor. 3 days after Ethan's visit, my phone rang with Michael's number displayed on the screen. My heart leapt to my throat as I answered with a tentative, "Hello? Mom." Just that one word, spoken in a voice rough with emotion, nearly undid me. "Can we talk? In person?" We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a small park halfway between Springfield and Millfield, a place we had often stopped for picnics when Michael was a child. I arrived early, settling on a bench overlooking the duck pond, trying to calm my racing thoughts and prepare for whatever might come. When Michael's car pulled into the parking lot, I had to resist the urge to run to him. Instead, I remained seated, allowing him to approach at his own pace. He walked slowly toward me, his posture hesitant, his face showing the strain of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. He looked older than his 32 years as he sat beside me, leaving a careful distance between us. Neither of us spoke immediately, both watching the ducks glide across the water's surface, finding momentary refuge in the mundane beauty before us. "I don't know where to start," Michael finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no way to adequately apologize for what I've done, for what I allowed to happen to you. You were manipulated, Michael," I said gently, "by someone who had years of practice, who knew exactly which buttons to push, which insecurities to exploit." He shook his head, refusing the easy absolution. "That's part of it, yes, but I still made choices. I chose to believe things about you that contradicted everything I knew from a lifetime of being your son. I chose the path of least resistance. It was easier to accept Jessica's version than to challenge it, to risk conflict with her." He looked at me directly for the first time. "I was a coward, Mom, and you paid the price for my cowardice." The raw self-recrimination in his voice broke my heart. "Where's James?" I asked, deliberately changing direction, giving him a moment to collect himself. "With Jessica's sister," he replied, tension evident in his jaw. "I told Jessica I needed time to think, to process everything. She doesn't know I've seen the evidence. She thinks I'm just having doubts about the Boston move. And are you? Having doubts about more than just the move?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture that reminded me so powerfully of the boy he'd been. "Everything is in question now. Our entire relationship. Every decision we've made together. How can I trust anything when the foundation was built on manipulation and lies?" He turned more fully toward me. "Mom, did you know she orchestrated our first meeting at Dartmouth? She sought me out deliberately after researching me, the scholarship student with the doctor father and teacher mother, the project with potential who just needed the right connections and influences." His laugh was hollow, empty of humor. "I thought it was serendipity. This beautiful, sophisticated woman taking an interest in me. It was calculation from the very beginning." The revelation didn't surprise me after everything Marissa had shared, but it clearly devastated Michael to recognize how long the deception had been in place. "What are you going to do?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me since Ethan's visit. Michael stared out at the pond again, his profile so like Thomas's it made my chest ache. I don't know yet. There's James to consider in everything. He's innocent in all this. He swallowed hard. But I can't stay with her, Mom. Not after what I've learned. Not knowing what she did to you. What she's capable of doing to anyone who stands in her way. The relief that flooded through me was tempered by immediate concern for what lay ahead. Jessica wouldn't relinquish control easily. If Michael tried to leave her, especially if he sought custody of James, the situation could become even more volatile. I've spoken to a lawyer, Michael continued, as if reading my thoughts, documenting everything, the fabricated messages, the lies about incidents with James that never happened, the systematic campaign to isolate me from family. It won't be pretty if this goes to court, but I'll do whatever it takes to protect James, to make sure he doesn't grow up in that toxic environment. He reached for my hand then, tentatively, as if unsure he still had the right to such a gesture. I met him halfway, our fingers intertwining in familiar connection. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, tears finally spilling over. "For everything. For the birthdays missed, the cruel exclusion, the horrible things Jessica said about you, for not being the son you deserved. You're here now," I said simply, squeezing his hand. "That's what matters." We talked for hours, piecing together the puzzle of the past 4 years. Michael described how Jessica had gradually reframed his childhood memories, subtly at first. "Are you sure that's how it happened? That doesn't sound like something a caring mother would do." Then more aggressively as time went on. How she'd created situations where I would inevitably overstep, then react with calculated hurt and disappointment. How she'd isolated him not just from me, but from anyone who might offer a perspective that contradicted hers. "She even monitored my phone," he admitted, shame evident in his voice. "Installed tracking software so she could see who I was calling, what websites I visited. I thought it was about shared transparency, about trust. It was about control." As painful as the conversation was, it also brought healing. With each revelation, each acknowledgement of the manipulation they'd both endured, the invisible wall between us crumbled further. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, something fundamental had shifted between us. Not a complete restoration, not yet, but the beginning of a bridge across the chasm Jessica had created. "I should go," Michael said reluctantly, checking his watch. "I told Jessica I'd be back by 7 to put James to bed. I can't confront her yet. Not until I have the legal groundwork in place." The lawyer advised me to proceed carefully. I understood the strategy, but the thought of him returning to that house, pretending normalcy with the woman who had orchestrated such pain, made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Will you be okay?" I asked, unable to keep the maternal concern from my voice. "She's dangerous, Michael. Not physically, perhaps, but psychologically." "I know who I'm dealing with now," he assured me, standing and helping me to my feet. "The advantage is mine as long as she doesn't realize that. I've learned from the best manipulator in the business. I can play the role she expects for a little while longer." Before we parted, Michael embraced me properly for the first time in over a year. A real hug, tight and desperate. His face buried in my shoulder like when he was a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. "I love you, Mom," he whispered against my cardigan. I never stopped. Not really, even when I thought I had reason to pull away. Somewhere underneath all her programming, I always knew who you really were. I held him just as tightly, savoring the solid reality of my son in my arms again. "I love you too, Michael. Always have. Always will. No matter what happens next." What happened next came sooner than either of us expected. 2 days later, I received a frantic call from Michael shortly after noon. "She knows," he said without preamble, his voice tight with tension. "Jessica knows I've seen the evidence, that I've talked to you. She went through my email while I was showering this morning, found messages from the lawyer, from Ethan. She's threatening to take James and disappear if I try to leave her." Cold fear gripped my heart. "Where are you now?" "At work." She showed up here, made a scene in the lobby, kept screaming that I was betraying our family, that I'd regret choosing that manipulative bitch over my own wife and child. The strain in his voice was palpable. Security had to escort her out. "I'm leaving now to go home, to make sure James is okay. She's not in a rational state. Do you want me to meet you there?" I offered, already reaching for my car keys. "No," he said firmly. "Not yet. Let me handle this first step. I'll call you as soon as I can." The hours that followed were among the most agonizing of my life. I paced my small apartment, jumping at every sound, checking my phone obsessively for updates. Linda came over to wait with me after I called her in tears, unable to bear the tension alone. "He'll be all right," she assured me, though the worry in her eyes belied her confident words. "Michael is stronger than he's been allowed to believe, and he has truth on his side now." It was nearly 7 in the evening when my doorbell rang. Linda and I exchanged anxious glances before I hurried to answer it. Michael stood on my doorstep, looking utterly exhausted but resolute, and in his arms, blinking sleepily against my porch light, was James. "Nana," the baby said clearly, reaching his chubby hands toward me with complete recognition, as if the months of separation had never happened. "Nana House." Through a blur of tears, I ushered them inside, closing the door firmly on the old life as we stepped together into something new and uncertain and infinitely precious. "Jessica's gone," Michael explained as we settled in my living room, James contentedly exploring a set of keys Linda had offered him. When I got home, she had already packed some bags. She started screaming as soon as I walked in. Awful things, threats, accusations. Then suddenly she just stopped, got very calm, very cold. He shuddered at the memory. She said, "Keep the brat. He was just leverage anyway, a means to an end. I'm done playing house with you and your pathetic family." She just left James? I couldn't comprehend it, even knowing everything else Jessica had done. Michael nodded grimly. She never wanted to be a mother. Not really. It was part of the picture she was creating. The perfect professional couple with their perfect child, living their perfect life. Once that picture shattered, once I made it clear I was leaving her regardless of her threats, James became an inconvenience rather than an asset. He looked at his son, playing innocently on my carpet, and his expression softened with love and fierce protection. Her parents are involved too. Vivian called while Jessica was packing, kept saying stick to the contingency plan and remember what we discussed about leverage. I recorded it all. My lawyer already has the audio. "What happens now?" Linda asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. "Legally, it's complicated," Michael admitted. "I've filed for emergency temporary custody based on Jessica's abandonment and the documented psychological manipulation. Her leaving voluntarily actually strengthens my case considerably. There will still be hearings, evaluations, probably some ugly accusations from the Davis family." He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "But tonight I just needed James to be somewhere safe, somewhere with family who truly loves him. I hope it's okay that we came here." "Of course it's okay," I assured him, my heart so full it felt it might burst. "This is your home, both of you for as long as you need it." After Linda left, and James was tucked into a makeshift bed in my spare room, Michael and I sat at my kitchen table, talking in low voices over cups of tea. The conversation was no longer about the past, about Jessica's manipulation or Michael's complicity or my pain, but about the future we now needed to build from the wreckage. "It won't be easy," Michael acknowledged, running a tired hand over his face. "Jessica's family has connections, money, influence. They'll fight dirty. So will we," I replied with quiet determination. "Not dirty, but hard, with truth and documentation and the support of people who genuinely care about you and James." Michael nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I kept the house key, you know, the one to the blue Victorian. Even after we sold it, even after Jessica accidentally threw away most of the keepsakes from my childhood, I couldn't let go of that one thing. The mention of our old family home, the one where Michael had grown up, where Thomas and I had built our life together, brought a fresh wave of emotion. "Why that particular item?" I asked softly. Michael turned the mug in his hands, considering. "Because it represented safety, I think. Home. The knowledge that no matter what happened out in the world, there was a place where I was completely loved, completely accepted." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. Jessica could never understand that. For her, houses were status symbols. Homes were stages for performing the life you wanted others to envy. She could never grasp what that blue Victorian meant, what you and Dad created there. In that moment, I knew that regardless of the legal battles ahead, Regardless of Jessica's next moves or the Davis family's attempts to regain control, we had already won the most important victory. Michael had reclaimed not just his relationship with me, but his understanding of himself, of what family truly meant. He had broken free of the false narrative that had been constructed around him, rediscovering the authentic core of who he was and what he valued. And James, sleeping peacefully in the next room, would grow up knowing the truth about his heritage, about the Mitchell family's legacy of love and loyalty, about the grandmother who had never stopped fighting to be part of his life. The road ahead would not be smooth. Jessica's public accusations and dramatic exit had already created ripples through both our communities. The Davis family's influence ensured the situation would be portrayed in ways that favored their daughter, that painted Michael as the villain, me as the interfering mother who destroyed a marriage. But we had something Jessica and her parents would never understand. Something their money and connections couldn't replicate or defeat. The power of genuine love, of shared history, of truth that could withstand scrutiny because it was lived rather than fabricated. As Michael finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep on my sofa with his father's old quilt pulled around him, I stood in the doorway watching him. My son returned to me against all odds. In the quiet of that moment, I felt Thomas's presence more strongly than I had in years, as if he too were standing guard over our reunited family. "We did good, Thomas," I whispered into the darkness. "Despite everything, despite everyone who tried to tear it apart, what we built together endured." And in the peace that followed, I could almost hear his reply. "I never doubted it would, Ellie. Never for a moment." 1 year later, I stood in the backyard of Michael's new house, a modest Cape Cod on a tree-lined street in Millfield, watching James toddle across the grass in pursuit of a butterfly. At 2 years old, he was a bundle of energy and curiosity, his dark hair and serious eyes so reminiscent of Michael at that age that sometimes it took my breath away. "Be careful by the garden, sweetheart," I called, as he veered toward the flower beds I'd helped Michael plant earlier that spring. James turned at the sound of my voice, flashing a grin that displayed his newest teeth before adjusting his course. So much had changed in the 12 months since that night when Michael and James had appeared on my doorstep, seeking refuge from the storm Jessica had unleashed. So much healing, so much rebuilding, so much learning to trust again. All of us, in different ways. The legal battle had been ugly, as expected. Jessica returned from her dramatic departure with a vengeance once she realized Michael was serious about pursuing full custody of James. The Davis family deployed their considerable resources, hiring high-priced lawyers, attempting to influence the family court judge through social connections, spreading rumors about Michael's mental state and my unhealthy influence on the family dynamic. But they hadn't anticipated the meticulous documentation Michael had accumulated before confronting Jessica. The recorded conversations, the emails between Jessica and her mother outlining their manipulation tactics, the testimony from Marissa about the fabricated incidents and messages. Most damaging of all was Jessica's own behavior, her abandonment of James, her volatile emotional swings, her admission, captured on Michael's phone recording, that her son had been just leverage in her larger plans. The custody evaluation had been thorough and ultimately devastating to Jessica's case. The psychologist appointed by the court had identified patterns consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, noting Jessica's inability to prioritize James's needs over her own desires and her tendency to view him as an extension of herself rather than as an individual. In the end, Michael was granted full legal and physical custody, with Jessica allowed only supervised visitation, visits she attended sporadically at first, then with decreasing frequency, until she finally stopped coming altogether about 4 months ago. Her new job in Washington keeps her very busy, she'd explained coolly during her last visit, barely looking at James as he showed her the finger painting he'd made especially for her. And really, these supervised sessions are so artificial. Not worth the time investment. Not worth the time investment. Her own child. Michael had been devastated for James, though not surprised by Jessica's abandonment. He deserves better, he'd said that night after putting his confused, tearful son to bed. He deserves a mother who sees his value beyond what he can do for her image or agenda. I'd held my son as he grieved not just for James's loss, but for his own, for the marriage he'd believed in, for the partner he thought he had, for the future he'd envisioned that had turned out to be built on illusion. "James has you," I'd reminded him gently, "and Linda, and Sarah, and Robert, and me. He has a family who loves him completely, who sees him for exactly who he is and cherishes every part. That had been the turning point. The moment when Michael began to shift from looking backward at what had been lost to looking forward at what could still be built. The move to Millfield had come a few months later, once the custody arrangement was finalized. Michael had taken a position with a smaller architectural firm, one without ties to the Davis family or their sphere of influence. The salary was less than he'd been making in Springfield, but the decrease in status was offset by a profound increase in autonomy and authenticity. We'd settled into new rhythms of connection and support. 3 days a week, I cared for James while Michael worked. Sundays were family dinner days, with various combinations of Mitchell's gathering around Michael's dining table or mine, rebuilding the bonds Jessica had tried so hard to sever. James was growing up surrounded by cousins, aunts, uncles, the extended family network that had always been the backbone of our lives before Jessica's interference. The healing wasn't always linear. Michael still had moments of crushing guilt over what he'd allowed to happen, over the time I'd lost with James, over his own susceptibility to Jessica's manipulation. I still had flashbacks to the darkest periods of isolation and gaslighting, moments when a casual comment or innocent situation would trigger memories of that painful time. But we talked about these things openly now. No more secrets, no more unexpressed pain, no more walking on eggshells around difficult truths. If Jessica had taught us anything valuable, it was the destructive power of silence and the healing potential of honest communication. "Mom, look what James found." Michael's voice pulled me from my reflections as he crossed the yard, James proudly carrying something in his cupped hands. "Show Nana," James instructed as they reached me, carefully opening his fingers to reveal a small, perfect robin's egg, vivid blue against his pink palm. "It must have fallen from a nest," Michael explained, smiling at his son's evident delight in the discovery. "We thought maybe we could keep it in that little glass dish on the windowsill. What do you think?" "I think that's a wonderful idea," I agreed, bending to James's level. "It's the exact same color as Daddy's childhood home, the blue Victorian where he grew up." "Blue Torian," James repeated solemnly, testing the unfamiliar words. "Daddy house." "That's right," Michael confirmed, a shadow of old sadness crossing his features. "I wish I could show it to you, buddy, but we had to sell it a long time ago." "Actually," I said carefully, having saved this news for the right moment, "that might not be entirely impossible." Both Michael and James looked at me with matching expressions of curiosity. "I had coffee with Helen Woods yesterday. You remember her, Michael? She was our neighbor on Maple Street. Her daughter Rebecca bought the blue Victorian 3 years ago, but she's being transferred to Seattle for work. The house is going on the market next month." I paused, watching comprehension dawn in Michael's eyes. "Helen says Rebecca would consider a private sale to us before listing it publicly. If that's something you might be interested in." Michael stared at me, emotions washing across his face in rapid succession. Shock, hope, uncertainty, yearning. "Mom, I can't. On my current salary, there's no way I could afford it." "Not alone, no," I agreed. "But I've been thinking. My apartment is too big for just me, especially now that I'm spending so much time here with you two. What if we pooled our resources, sold both our current places and purchased the Victorian together? You and James would have the main living spaces, and I could convert the old sunroom into a separate apartment for myself. Privacy for all of us, but togetherness when we want it. A multi-generational household," Michael said slowly, the idea taking root, like families used to have. Like what makes actual practical and emotional sense, instead of the isolated nuclear families we're all supposed to want now. "Exactly," I smiled, remembering similar conversations we'd had years ago, before Jessica, before her toxic individualism had infected Michael's worldview. "Of course, it's just an idea, something to consider." "Blue Torian," James insisted, clearly picking up on the excitement, though he couldn't fully understand its source. "James' house too?" Michael laughed, the sound freer and more genuine than I'd heard in years. "Maybe, buddy. Maybe it could be James's house too." He looked at me, eyes bright with possibility. "Let's talk numbers tonight after he's in bed. See if we could really make this work." As they headed inside to find the glass dish for James's treasure, I remained in the backyard a moment longer, savoring the perfect spring afternoon and the even more perfect sense of rightness that had settled over our lives. There was still pain in our story, still scars that might never fully fade, Jessica remained a shadow presence, especially for Michael, who continued to process the profound betrayal he'd experienced at her hands. The Davis family's influence ensured that occasional rumors or social media gossip would flare up, attempting to reignite old conflicts or create new ones. But those external forces no longer had the power to define us, or to drive wedges between us. We had reclaimed our narrative, our true history, our authentic connections, our genuine values. As I finally turned to follow Michael and James into the house, I thought about the nature of family, how it isn't defined by performance or appearance or social standing, but by the steady presence of love through both darkness and light, by the willingness to see each other clearly, to honor each other's truths, to stand together against those who would divide us. Jessica had nearly succeeded in destroying what Thomas and I had built, what generations of Mitchells had sustained through world wars and economic depressions and personal tragedies. She had used every weapon in her considerable arsenal: manipulation, isolation, gaslighting, outright lies, to erase me from my son's life, to sever the bonds between Michael and his heritage. In the end, though, authentic connection had proved stronger than fabricated division. Truth had outlasted deception. Love, complicated, imperfect, but unfailingly loyal, had prevailed over calculated strategy. Inside, I found Michael and James at the kitchen table, carefully placing the robin's egg in a small crystal dish, one that had belonged to Thomas's mother, salvaged from the blue Victorian before its sale. The afternoon sunlight caught the egg's vibrant blue, casting tiny reflections across their faces as they bent together over the small treasure. "There," Michael said, adjusting the dish's position on the windowsill. "Perfect." And it was. Not because our lives had returned to some idealized state before Jessica's entrance, not because all wounds had healed without scars, but because we were facing forward together, honoring our past while creating a new future, one based on genuine connection rather than performance or pretense. James looked up at me with Thomas's earnest eyes and Michael's childhood face, reaching for my hand with complete trust. "Nana stay?" "Yes, sweetheart," I assured him, my heart full beyond measure as I joined my family at the table. "Nana's staying for good."